Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Let's make our intentions sincerely for the sake of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We stopped off in the previous session speaking, or we were going to speak about the power of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The power of Allah, it is known in Arabic as Al-Qudrah, Qudratullah. Likewise, some scholars refer to it as Al-Quwwah, the attribute of Al-Qudrah, power, or Al-Quwwah also. So Allah is necessarily attributed with power over everything. So He has power over everything. What is meant by thing, shay', like when we say Allahu qadirun ala kulli shay', Allah has power over every shay', everything. What is meant by shay' is al-jaiz al-aqli. And this means the intellectually possible matters. The mental possibilities, those things that can actually exist. Those things that can actually begin to exist and hence come into existence. These are the only things that can begin to exist, and therefore mentally they are the only things that the power of Allah pertains to, because everything else, either it is already existing, which is Allah Himself and His attributes, or it's intellectually impossible and it cannot exist. So when we say Allah has power over everything, this is a correct statement. And everything means every mental possibility, everything that is intellectually possible. Because that which is intellectually necessary already exists, Allah and His attributes. And that which is impossible will never exist. So the power of Allah does not pertain to which is necessary and that which is intellectually impossible. So in the footnote we have the mental possibility is that which its existence is valid at one instant and its non-existence is valid at another instant. So we, for example, our existence, a human being's existence, is valid at one point in time, and then that very human ceases to exist on this earth. So this human being, is a mental possibility. He may exist at one time and then may not exist at another time. The power of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, hence, does not pertain to the intellectual necessity, which is not like this what we just mentioned. The intellectual necessity refers to Allah and the attributes of Allah. The mind does not conceive that Allah may exist and then may not exist. No, Allah must exist. His existence is necessary. So the power of Allah does not pertain to that which is absolutely necessary, meaning Himself and His attributes. Nor does it pertain to the intellectually impossible matters, which do not accept to exist. It's like saying, this will never exist, why talk about it? This matter, it can never ever exist. So the question doesn't even arise about this matter. We know it can't exist, full stop, that's the end. It can't exist. So for someone to then come and delve and ask, well, can Allah, or Allah, is He able to, or does He have the power? The matter is intellectually impossible. It will never exist. So the power of Allah does not pertain to it. This is why then it's not said, because the following matter that I'm going to mention is intellectually impossible. For this reason, it's not said does Allah have the power to create a similar to him, or does Allah have the power to create another God? The existence of another so-called God is impossible. There will always only ever be one God. It's impossible for there to be two of these in existence. The meaning of God is that he's the only one. So a person doesn't delve and say, well, is it possible? Can Allah, or is he able to, or does he have the power to? Or it cannot exist. So we say, rightfully, the power of Allah doesn't relate to this matter that doesn't even exist. It can never exist. And some people are stubborn. Some people just don't get it. They say, oh, but still, does he have the power to? Can he? It can't exist. It is actually kufr to ask such a question. To ask such a question when something like this is intellectually impossible. If someone says, can Allah create another God? Then in this question, there is doubt about the oneness of Allah. Doubt about the fact that Allah, his self and his attributes, they are attributed, or rather the attributes are attributed exclusively to Allah. Only Allah is attributed with these attributes. And likewise, Allah is wahdahu in his self, meaning that this is exclusive to Allah. So if someone says, well, can God create another God? What that means is that this person, it's like them saying, well, I'm not sure. Maybe there can be another God. So let me ask, can Allah do it or not? And then in this, a person would have committed kufr. Because if you look back to the 13 attributes at the beginning, we mentioned that if anybody doubts about one of the 13 or denies one of the 13 attributes, then this is considered kufr. One of those 13 attributes is that Allah is wahid. Allah is attributed with wahdaniyah. Allah does not have a partner. So for someone to doubt and say, well, can he create another God? It's like saying, well, is it possible for there to be another God? Then they are committing kufr because they doubted in this issue. So to ask such a question is kufr, takes a person out of al-Islam. To say yes is also kufr, and to say no is also kufr. Like if someone said, can God create another God? If someone says yes, then this means that they believe that it's possible for there to be two gods. And that is surely kufr. It's against la ilaha illallah. If somebody then says no, that God does not have the power, or God is unable, or God cannot, or any words like this that they understand the meanings of, that denote weakness, these statements are kufr statements. Because yes, although the power of Allah does not pertain to this matter of creating another so-called God, it cannot be. Although the power of Allah does not relate to this matter, then we should express it in this way, with this meaning that the power of Allah doesn't pertain to it. It can't even exist. Now to come around and say, well, no, Allah can't do it, then this is as though they are saying Allah is weak. And this is an insult. This is an insult. Okay, someone might misexpress themselves. That's understood. Someone might misexpress themselves. They only understood that it cannot be. And they didn't understand from the words that they were saying that Allah is weak and so on. Yes, this person has a different judgment. But we're talking about the meaning of this statement that Allah cannot. This is an insult to Allah. At the same time, that doesn't mean that there can be two so-called gods, two or three or more. There is only one God. So it is kufr to answer such questions by saying yes or no. So that's three cases in one. The one that asks, the one that says yes, and the one that says no. All of them destroy themselves. All of them commit kufr. And this originally was a ploy that was set into motion by some of the atheists in the late 1900s, like 1970s, 1980s, to try to trick the Muslims. Rather, one says these are self-contradictory questions that are intellectual impossibilities, and the intellectual impossibilities do not relate to the power of Allah. One way in which a person can answer is to say, your question is wrong. That doesn't even make sense. That doesn't even make sense. Like we sometimes give the example of saying, if someone was to say, well, can a triangle be a square? Can a circle be a rectangle? Or here, make a circle that's a rectangle. It doesn't even make sense. So this is one way in which one can respond to this question. So they won't be saying yes, they won't be saying no. They'll say that doesn't even make sense. Or if a person wants to go further, they say this doesn't even relate. This doesn't even pertain to the power of Allah. The power of Allah pertains to the intellectual possibilities. What you're saying is contradictory. In other words, saying yes, that Allah can have a partner or can have a partner, saying yes results in an impossibility, which is for there to be more than one God. And by saying no, this results in an impossibility, which is for Allah to be weak and powerless, disabled or powerless. Hence, this excludes, we read this already. Okay, Ibn Hazm opposed the stance of Ahlus Sunnah. He was a misguided person, Ibn Hazm. He said, Allah, the mighty and great, has the power to take a child for himself. Just that, saying that is kufr. Why? Because it's saying it's possible that Allah would have a child. Just to entertain that possibility, to confirm it like that, this is kufr. He continued, he said, Allah, the mighty and great, has the power to take a child for himself. He said, if Allah did not have the power to do that, he would be weak. However, now that's the end of his statement. However, what Ibn Hazm said is not necessarily the case, and his statement is kufr. What Ibn Hazm said, so in the footnote, what Ibn Hazm said is kufr, because the meaning of his statement is that it is possible for the eternal to be hadith. What he's saying is that it's possible for the eternal, i.e. the one without a beginning, Allah, to change or to be weak, i.e. to be like the creation. Because if someone said Allah had a son or Allah had a child, they would be attributing something to Allah that has a beginning, and this is kufr. This necessitates change in the self of Allah. This is because the one that something separates from him, like a child, would be attributed with change and therefore itself be created. And of course, Allah is not like that. In other words, whatever accepts to be a location for newly occurring events, so they're saying that Allah is a location is something that accepts inherently change, then this must itself be a newly occurring event, because something within it has a beginning to its existence, so it must have a beginning to its existence. It's saying that if you attribute an attribute to Allah which has a beginning, i.e., it has changed, it wasn't, then it was, then this necessitates weakness to the self that this attribute is attributed to. Attributing a child to Allah would necessitate that Allah is weak. Wal-'iyadhu billah. So what Ibn Hazm said is wrong, because having a child is intellectually impossible for Allah. And the intellectually impossible is not considered with reference to the power of Allah. Now, why is it that power might not pertain to something, even in humans? Why is it that one of us might be powerless over something? Now, either because of a deficiency, you can't pick up your car, for example. You can't lift certain things up. You can't run from here to a mile away in 10 seconds. It's either because you are deficient, you are weak, it's because of an inability within you. And this is the case in reference to the creation. For example, the creation does not have the power to bring something into existence from non-existence. So we can't create. That's because of a deficiency and an inability within us. Also, it could be because that matter in question, it does not accept to come into existence. So if there is something that is impossible, for example, for me to draw a three-sided square. Now, this is impossible. I can't draw it, you can't draw it. A three-sided square or a four-sided triangle. Now, this isn't weakness on my part. We don't say, oh, I'm unable, I'm weak, I can't do that. Rather, it's because that matter can't even exist. So in this regard, I wouldn't be considered to be unable or powerless over that matter, because that matter doesn't accept to come into existence. So we said that powerlessness or inability might be because of a deficiency or a weakness. That's the first case. Also, powerlessness might be because that thing itself, that thing in question, it does not accept to come into existence. It's actually impossible. So that's not weakness on my part, it's just that thing, it cannot be. Third now, because this matter does not accept non-existence. So there is a matter that does not accept existence. So that's why my strength, my power doesn't relate to it. It doesn't accept existence. There's another matter now that must exist. The mind doesn't accept that it would not exist. And this is the intellectually necessary, which is Allah and the attributes of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. These must exist. So even when we refer to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, we say that the power of Allah, it does not pertain to what is intellectually necessary, because that which Allah does with His power is that Allah brings things into existence and takes things out of existence. Allah and His attributes always exist. They won't come into existence, they won't start, and they won't go out of existence. So the power of Allah doesn't relate to them. Because what does Allah do with His power? brings things into existence and takes them out of existence. Allah and His attributes must always exist. They don't accept to come into existence and go out of existence. So the power of Allah does not pertain to the intellectually necessary matters. So both of these, you have on one end the intellectually impossible, and then you have the intellectually necessary. The intellectually impossible matters, they cannot exist. So the power of Allah doesn't pertain to them. We don't say Allah is weak or powerless. No, the power of Allah doesn't even pertain to them because they can't exist. Now, also, when it comes to the intellectually necessary matters, we say the power of Allah doesn't pertain to them because the power of Allah is that with which Allah brings into existence and takes out of existence. The intellectually necessary must always exist. It's impossible for them to come into existence because they already exist. And it's impossible for the attributes of Allah to go out of existence because they're everlasting. So the power of Allah does not pertain to the intellectually impossible, and it does not pertain to the intellectually necessary matters. The inability that is negated from the power of Allah, the Exalted, is the first one. Meaning that what we don't say about the power of Allah is that Allah is, so we don't say this, we don't say Allah is weak. We don't say that there is an intellectually possible matter that Allah is unable to create or take out of existence. We don't say that. So the inability that is negated from the power of Allah, the Exalted, is the first, i.e., we negate inability and weakness from the power of Allah with regards to the intellectual possibility. Not the second one, which is with reference to the intellectually impossible. No, this does not pertain to the power of Allah. The power of Allah doesn't pertain to it. Likewise, the intellectually necessary, because we do not even consider these in reference to the power of Allah. It is neither permissible to say that Allah has power to do that, i.e., to create, for example, another God, and nor do we say that Allah is unable to do that, as we mentioned. Some scholars said, this is just like you do not say about the stone that it is knowledgeable or that it is ignorant. The stone is not attributed with life. A stone, any stone, a brick. You don't say, that's one clever brick. Or you don't say that, that brick, what a stupid brick. Okay? You don't attribute intelligence or a lack of intelligence to it because it doesn't apply. If someone heard you saying, this is a very, very clever brick, it's very, very intelligent, it's very knowledgeable, let's ask it a question. People will think you've gone mad because it doesn't apply. Knowledge and ignorance don't apply to the brick. Likewise, if someone was to say about a brick that the brick is a Muslim, the brick it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have life. Like if someone was to say the brick is a kafir, it doesn't apply. Even if someone pushes you and says, no, but which one is it? Because it doesn't apply. In a similar way, we're saying that the intellectually impossible matters like the existence of another so-called God, it doesn't even apply. It cannot exist. So we don't say, well, go on then tell me, can Allah do it or not? It doesn't apply. We say, it can't exist. The power of Allah does not pertain to it. Just like the question about the brick, is it a Muslim or a kafir? It doesn't apply to the brick. The question doesn't apply to it. I.e., knowledge and ignorance do not relate to the stone. and the intellectual impossibility and intellectual necessity do not relate to the power of Allah, just as I explained. This is similar to how we respond to the saying of some atheists, which is also a kufr statement. When they ask, remember, we don't say yes, we don't say no, we say this is impossible. So they say, is Allah able to create one like himself? In this question, inherently, there is a mistake, there is a contradiction, which is that there is in the question deeming possible that which is intellectually impossible. And that is self-contradictory. To explain this further, Allah exists without a beginning. And had he had a similar, then that similar would also exist without a beginning. And that which exists without a beginning is not created because it is already existent. Hence, how would the always existing, which is this supposed second God, how would this always existing and eternal being, how would it be created? It's a contradiction. If someone says, well, Allah has the power to create another so-called God. This so-called God, if someone was to give it the attributes of God, then it would have to exist without a beginning. So just by the mere fact that someone says, well, Allah is able to create, give a beginning to another so-called God, then already that being is not going to be referred to as God because it has a beginning. It doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. Hence, how would the always existing, the so-called second God, be created? Thus, the self-contradiction is clear in the question. It's like saying, can the eternal create another eternal being? It's like saying, can the one that doesn't have a beginning create another one that doesn't have a beginning? Or can the one that doesn't have a beginning give a beginning to another one that is not supposed to have a beginning? It's mad. Because what is created by definition is not eternal without a beginning. Hence, as aforementioned, for the intellectual impossibility, its non-acceptance of entering into existence is clear. Again, as for the intellectually impossible matter, its non-acceptance of entering into existence, this is clear, that it cannot exist. As for the intellectual necessity, Allah and His attributes that must exist always without a beginning and without an end, it does not accept to come into existence after non-existence, because its existence is eternal, i.e., its existence was not preceded by non-existence. So it cannot come into existence from non-existence because it is always existing, as I previously explained. This is just a repeat. There is a difference between existing and coming into existence. Like, for example, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala exists. And we say Allah exists. And this is correct to say. There is no harm in saying that. Rather, it's a must. Allah exists. Now, for something to come into existence, what does that necessitate? It necessitates that it did not exist and that now it will start to exist. This second one, we cannot say about Allah. And we cannot say about the attributes of Allah, that Allah comes into existence, meaning He wasn't and then He is. or that an attribute, even one attribute of Allah, comes into existence. This also we don't say, because by definition it means it was not and now it is. This would necessitate that the self of Allah is attributed with weak attributes, those that have beginnings. Wal-'iyadhu billah. As for coming into existence, then that is the newly occurring existence that has a beginning. The intellectual necessity refers to Allah and His attributes. Al-wajib al-aqli. Al-wajib al-aqli. The existence of Allah is an intellectual necessity. His existence is without a beginning, and His attributes are also without a beginning. They've always existed. Allah has always existed. Thus, it is not said about Allah or His attributes that they came into existence, because that means that they started. Something that starts, this means that it did not exist before and then it happened. And this is the creation. This is in the creation. As for Allah, Allah has always existed. Allah does not have a beginning. Likewise, the attributes of Allah, they do not have a beginning. So it is not said about Allah or His attributes that they came into existence, because the existence of Allah and His attributes are without a beginning. Hence our saying, the saying of the Muslims, the intellectual necessity does not accept coming into existence, because Allah already exists. So how could we say that He comes into existence? And the things that Allah creates with His power, He brings them into existence. His self and His attributes don't accept to come into existence because they already exist. It's like saying, like there's something that the scholars refer to as tahsilul hasil, and they say tahsilul hasil is muhal. They say this is impossible. Like if I was to say, ask one of you to get up and shut the door. If I say get up and shut the door, how can you shut a door that's closed? It's impossible. So Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala exists. For someone to say that His power pertains to Himself and His power pertains to His attributes, that's like saying that an impossibility can occur, which is that Allah, who is supposed to have existed without a beginning, suddenly it's as though we're saying that no, He can have a beginning. It doesn't make sense. Allah already exists. How can one say the power of Allah pertains to Allah Ta'ala? Allah already exists. And the power of Allah, Allah creates new things with it. How would it be the case that Allah Ta'ala already exists and then someone says, well, Allah can create a new self for Himself? Wal-'iyadhu billah. It is intellectually impossible. Hence our saying the intellectual necessity does not accept coming into existence is correct, because coming into existence means to exist after not existing. So not existing and then existing. And it is not said about Allah, the Eternal, that He exists after non-existence. However, the understanding of some beginners in learning the Aqidah, the correct creed, might be deficient in this issue. This is if it is not explained properly. As for the one who is well versed in this issue, the intended meaning is clear. the knowledge of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Know that al-ilm, that the knowledge of Allah is qadim, meaning without a beginning, like all of the attributes of Allah. Just as His self, Allah, is without a beginning. Hence, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala never ceased to be knowledgeable. Allah never stopped being knowledgeable. Likewise, Allah didn't begin to be knowledgeable. The knowledge of Allah doesn't have a beginning, that it was at one point that suddenly Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala started to know everything. No, Allah has always been knowledgeable without that knowledge having a beginning. And Allah is everlastingly knowledgeable. Allah will not stop being knowledgeable. Allah doesn't forget. Likewise, Allah doesn't remember things, like having forgotten and then remembering. Because that would mean that His attribute, it starts, it begins. Parts, if one was to say that parts of His attribute, they begin. So He remembers, wal-'iyadhu billah, certain things. The attributes of Allah, it's important to remember and focus that one of the core principles about the attributes of Allah is that they exist without a beginning. So the knowledge of Allah is eternal and it is without a beginning. Hence, Allah never ceased to be knowledgeable and never began being knowledgeable. Rather, He is and was always knowledgeable. Knowledgeable about His self, knowledgeable about His attributes, knowledgeable about what He has created, what He has not created, what He will create and what He will not create. All of this is known to Allah. Thus, Allah is not attributed with a knowledge that exists after non-existence. So it wasn't that Allah didn't know and then He started to know. No, it's not like that. Because had it been permissible for Allah to be attributed with newly occurring attributes, new knowledge, new pieces of information, then being without a beginning would have been negated. Someone says, well, Allah learns new pieces of information. That would mean that our belief about Allah, that He exists without a beginning, by that statement of ours, that would be invalidated. This is because whatever accepts to be a location for newly occurring events must itself be a newly occurring event. If someone attributes to Allah an attribute that has a beginning, an attribute of weakness, then this necessitates, this shows us that that self that the attribute is attributed to is also weak. Ma'adh Allah. And these are not the attributes of Allah. Those that are weak and that start and begin and are initiated. Any verse of the Quran which to some people could give the false impression that the knowledge of Allah occurs from anew, then know that this is not the intended meaning. This is such as what Allah Ta'ala revealed in Surah Al-Anfal, Surah 8, Ayah 66. Allah Ta'ala mentioned, الآن خفف الله عنكم وعلم أن فيكم ضعفا. This ayah, if taken literally, would mean now Allah has lightened for you the ruling of jihad. And He knew about weakness in you. If someone takes this literally, then because of their ignorance in this issue of creed, they may read it as it is now, right now, that Allah has relieved you or lightened the situation for you, and it is now that Allah has come to know. Like to say, Allah has found out just now that you actually have weakness in you. That's why He lightened the situation. This is if it's taken literally, because of the word al-ana, which literally means now. It's as though they're saying Allah. It's like they are saying, al-ana alima Allah anna fikum da'fan. That it's right now that Allah found out. It occurred to Allah, wal-'iyadhu billah, that you have weakness in you, and that is why He lightened the situation, a certain aspect of jihad. The intended meaning of this ayah is not the literal meaning, i.e. that Allah now started to know, or that now Allah learned it. No. And the statement وَعَلِمَ in the middle there, and He knew, does not refer back to the part of the verse in which it states now. Rather, it is now that Allah had eternally willed that the situation would be lightened. And it isn't also, and it's not the case that also it is now that Allah realized, or found out, or gained knowledge of this, that there is weakness in you. No. Rather, the meaning is that Allah Ta'ala has now lightened the ruling for you because Allah eternally knew that there would be a weakness in you. And likewise, Allah Ta'ala revealed in Surah Muhammad, Surah 47, Ayah 31, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ حَتَّى نَعْلَمَ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّابِرِينَ. Someone might take this literally and say that Allah mentioned that we, i.e. Allah, that we will certainly test you so that we can come to know or sieve out those ones among you that work hard and those ones among you that are patient. This is what the ignorant person who looks at the Quran might take this ayah to mean. That, wal-'iyadhu billah, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is saying that I'm going to test you to see how you do, so that I can, after this experimentation, I can come to know, I can learn about who among you are those that are patient and who among you are the ones that are working hard. Hatta na'lam. This is what someone might think. This verse, if translated literally, would mean, and we will test you, i.e. Allah will test you, until we would know the one who strives among you and those who are patient. This verse actually means Allah would test you so that Allah would make apparent for the creation. Not that Allah is testing to find out because Allah doesn't know. No. Rather, Allah would test you so as to make apparent to the rest of creation who among you strives and who among you is patient. Allah was already knowledgeable about that, as was narrated by Al-Bukhari in his book of Tafsir from Abu Ubaidah, Ma'mar ibn al-Muthanna. And this is similar to what Allah revealed in Ayah 37 of Surah Al-Anfal, Surah 8. لِيَمِيزَ اللَّهُ الْخَبِيثَ مِنَ الطَّيِّبِ. If someone took this literally, they would say, oh, this means that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala created such and such so that Allah could differentiate. Like this is a way for Allah, wal-'iyadhu billah, to differentiate, to notice the difference, to see who is khabith and who is good, who is evil and who is good. Otherwise, as though they're saying that before this Allah didn't know. So Allah devised a way to find out who is good. Let me gain knowledge, qad yuqal, of who is good and who is bad. This is not what the ayah means. This ayah means so that Allah would distinguish for the slaves, to make it apparent for the people, between the wicked and the good, between the bad people and the good people. In other words, so that Allah would make apparent for the slaves who is evil and who is good. So all this to say that Allah doesn't learn something new, because learning something new would mean that He gains, or that His attribute changes. The attribute of Allah is complete, it is perfect. And change is the biggest sign of something being a creation. Because that thing which changes requires one to change it. If someone says Allah learned something new, this means that Allah changes. And it means that Allah is in need of one to specify that change, to gauge that change, to set that change. Allah Ta'ala is attributed necessarily with divine life. Allah is attributed with life because attributing Allah with the opposite is an insult to Allah. Attributing Allah with being dead, with death, this is an insult to Allah. And if so, as well as saying Allah exists, one must say that Allah is alive. It's not the same thing. To say Allah is existing and that Allah is alive, one must believe in both, that He exists and He is alive. If someone negated Allah being alive, if they said, or if they doubted even, that Allah is alive or not, then they are also, by definition, saying, well then, if they're saying Allah is not alive, then they're saying, well, Allah also does not hear, does not see, does not have power, does not have will, and does not have knowledge. Why? Because that which is dead, it's impossible for it to be attributed with these attributes. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala mentioned that He is Sami' and Basir, and that He has a qudra, power, and irada, and ilm. So that which is dead, it cannot be attributed with these things. Look at a human, for example, who is dead. You don't say about him that he has knowledge. You don't say about him that he has a will, the choice to do things. He's dead, he's lifeless. He has no power, he's powerless. He cannot see and he cannot hear. As for if he has life, then it's possible for us to attribute these things to a human being. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is not like the creation. But to say about Allah that He is dead, this is an insult to Allah. And further to that, to say Allah is dead, this means, or that He is not attributed with life, this means that they're saying, well then Allah can, it's not valid then to attribute these other attributes to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So the attribution of life to Allah authenticates the attribution of knowledge, will, power, seeing and hearing to Allah. So Allah huwa hayy. Why do we say Allah is alive? Because Allah mentioned in the Quran, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy al-qayyum. Allah is alive. And then the intellect supports that in what we just mentioned. So it is a must to believe, or a must to attribute eternal life to Allah the Exalted. Hence, Allah is hayy, alive, unlike others who are alive, because the life of Allah is without a beginning and without an end. And His life is not by soul, our life is by soul. We, the jinn, animals, angels, we all have souls. And hence, this is how Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala created us. Allah made it be that things in general would be considered alive if the soul is in them. This is the case for the jinn, for animals, for humans, and the angels. Plants, however, don't have souls. Allah is not like the creation. We require a soul to remain alive. The life of Allah is without a soul. Allah created the soul. Our life, or rather the life of Allah, is not by soul and it's not by blood, nor is it by the passage of time. Time doesn't lapse upon Allah. The intellectual evidence for the necessity of His life, of attributing life to Allah, is the existence of this universe. Because had Allah not been alive, then nothing of the universe would exist. How is that? Because if He was not attributed with life, He would not be attributed with will. And Allah chose to create the universe with His power and by what Allah knew of what would be created. So if someone said, well, Allah is not attributed with life, and they want to say, I just believe Allah exists, I don't believe that He's alive, I don't attribute life to Him, then this person needs to understand that the saying necessitates that the world wouldn't exist, because then Allah would not be attributed with will, because that which is dead is not attributed with a will. Allah wouldn't have, according to this scenario, chosen for the world to exist, because according to this person, he was dead, and hence he did not have a will. So in the footnote here we have, this is because, so why is it that if Allah was not attributed with life, why is it that the creation wouldn't exist? That is because, this is because the universe exists due to it being created by a creator who is knowledgeable, attributed with will and power. And these attributes are not said about one except if they are attributed with life. This is why the scholars said, if Allah had not been alive, then nothing of the universe would have existed. So Allah is alive. Allah does not have a soul, Allah does not have a body, Allah does not have nerves, Allah does not have blood, Allah doesn't breathe in and out. Okay? The life of Allah is not like the life of the creation. Without doubt, the existence of the universe is confirmed by the senses. We see, hear, touch, smell. So the existence of the universe is confirmed by the senses and by necessity. Next, we have al-wahdaniyah. And this, it requires some explanation, so I think we'll leave it to next week, inshallah. And then we have left al-wahdaniyya, al-qiyamu bin-nafs, and al-mukhalafatu lil-hawadith. It's important for those of you who have the notes to this to read over this so that you understand the arguments, so that you understand the proofs, the intellectual proofs. There are many people that say to the Muslims that you are using logic. You use logic and don't use logic. Wal-'iyadhu billah. This is primarily the people that liken Allah to the creation. They say, just believe in what Allah has revealed. And then they'll say to you things like, Allah is above the throne, and so on and so on. And then if you ask them, if you say to them, well, Allah didn't reveal that, and they'll say, yes, in the Quran. But you say to them, no, Allah mentioned, revealed words like istawa, like yad, like a'yun. Now you are the one that is translating these words, and you are the one that is saying that istawa means to sit. You are the one that is saying that yad means hand. You are the one that is saying a'yun means many eyes, and then attributing them to Allah. And then you are the one, after this is your ill interpretation, you're saying we have to believe in your ill interpretation. Wal-'iyadhu billah. And then you say, well, if you don't believe in it, and if you use your logic, then you're a kafir, because anta tukadhibu sharia, because you are belying what Allah revealed. Well, what this person is saying is not what Allah revealed. This person believes in what they have interpreted. Allah mentioned in numerous places in the Quran, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Don't you use your minds? Why don't you use your minds? But subhanallah, subhanallah. Please go through this and make sure that you understand all of the proofs that are mentioned, whether they are in the Quran, and they are the base, whether they are in the Quran or they are intellectual proofs. Okay, we'll stop here, insha'Allah ta'ala. Let's say La ilaha illallah and as-salah ala nabi. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim.